Good afternoon. My name is Alfredo Fontanini, and I'm the chairperson of the Department of Neurobiology and Behavior. Thank you for joining us today, either if you chose to come in person or to log in our live stream. And welcome to the 27th Schwartz Foundation Mind-Brain Lecture. This lecture is hosted by the Department of Neurobiology and Behavior here at Stony Brook and generously funded by the Schwartz Foundation. The foundation was established in 1994 to support and promote theoretical and computational neuroscience. This is a cross-disciplinary field that integrates physics, mathematics, engineering, computer science, and neuroscience with the idea and the goal of understanding the relationship between neurons and behavior, the brain, and the mind. The foundation was a pioneer in supporting the birth of this field and was instrumental in its success and its impact. The foundation was and is the brainchild of Dr. Jerome Schwartz, Jerry Schwartz. Jerry is a physicist and an engineer. He is co-founder of Symbol Technologies and is an emeritus trustee at the Stony Brook Foundation Board. The Schwartz Mind-Brain Lecture was created in 1997 to advocate for a computational perspective on the brain and introduce fundamental challenges in the field of neuroscience to the Stony Brook community. Throughout the years, it brought to Stony Brook exceptional scientists presenting their research into the most significant fields of neuroscience and computation. This year's distinguished speaker is Dr. Anthony Zador. Dr. Zador received his BA in Linguistics from the University of California, Berkeley, and his MD PhD from Yale University. After completing his postdoctoral training at the Salk Institute in San Diego in 1999, Dr. Zador joined the faculty at Cold Spring Harbor Laboratory, where he is currently the Alle Davis Harrison Chair of Neuroscience, and he is the director of the Center for Neural Mechanisms of Cognition. At Cold Spring Harbor, Dr. Zador occupied several important leadership positions over the years, being the chair of the Neuroscience Division, as well as the director of the Sloan Schwartz Center for Computational Neuroscience. Dr. Zador is a very accomplished neuroscientist and one of the pioneers in blending a computational and experimental perspective to study the brain. Throughout his career, Dr. Zador has developed new methodological and conceptual approaches to understand neuronal function, brain organization, and their links to behavior. In recent years, Dr. Zador has been one of the leading figures behind NeuroAI, which is a new field that brings together neuroscience and artificial intelligence. He has published more than 90 scientific articles on journals such as Science, Nature, Cell, Nature Neuroscience, just to name a few, and his work has been cited almost 17,000 times. He is the recipient of numerous awards. He's received the prestigious NIH Transformative R1 Award. He's an Alle Distinguished Investigator and a Brain Research Foundation Fellow. In 2015, he was selected as one of the Foreign Policy 100 leading global thinkers. It is worth mentioning that in addition to his scientific contributions, Dr. Zador is known in the field and beyond for his leadership. He is the co-founder and chairperson of COSIGN. This is the leading annual meeting for computational and system neuroscience with more than 1,000 yearly attendees a year. And in fact, I have to thank him because COSIGN is going on right now, and he skipped COSIGN to be here with us today and delivering this lecture. He is also the force behind the NeuroAI initiative at Cold Spring Harbor, and he has written very influential opinion pieces that laid the foundation for the creation of NeuroAI as a field. Today, Dr. Zador will tell us about his groundbreaking work and ideas at the interface between AI and neuroscience. Please join me in welcoming this year's Schwartz main distinguished speaker, Dr. Tony Zador.
Well, thank you for that really kind introduction. It's really an honor to be here. I've attended many of these, and really it was a surprise and really a delight to be invited to give one. So I'm going to be talking, my lab actually does both neurobiology research, a straight up neuroscience with actual organisms, and computational work in artificial intelligence. Today I'm really going to focus on the AI side of the lab, but this really encapsulates both of it with both the AI and biological sides of it. So I really first got interested actually in neuroscience when I was a kid, and I watched a lot of science fiction. And these are some of the key shows that I watched growing up. And in a lot of them set in the future, there was always the assumption that we would have intelligent AI controlling robots. And the question was largely, what form would those robots take? Often those weren't even the center of the plot. It was just assumed that that was something that was going to be happening soon. And usually it was going to be happening quite soon. So I put a bunch of these on a timeline, and I put the dates in which they were set in red. In a couple cases, you can't tell. Star Wars was set in a long, long time ago in a galaxy far, far away, so we don't know exactly where to place that one. But for the most, one thing you'll notice is that the times are usually about 10 or 20 years ahead of when the show was actually made. So in the not too distant future. And well, we are now well beyond some of these, and we still really aren't at the level predicted, guaranteed, promised by the shows that I watched as a kid. And so when I got to graduate school, already that was a problem. That was the problem that I sort of set out to understand. Why don't we have these, right? So why aren't we there yet, and how do we get there? And I say safely because nowadays that we're actually maybe getting close, the question is, do we really want to be there, is a question that's coming up, and we could talk about that. But at the time, it was pretty clear to me that we did want to be there. So I'm going to try to provide my answer from a neuroscientist point of view of why we aren't there yet, and how can we get there, leaving aside the question of whether we want to be there. So. It always seemed to me that if we could just get one of these future AIs in our hands and take it apart, that would provide us the answer that we needed for how to build an AI, right? We could reverse engineer it. But unfortunately, we didn't have one. And then it dawned on me that, in fact, we do have something that's pretty close. We have natural intelligence. So that was actually a lot of what motivated me to become a neuroscientist, the idea that we have in front of us these systems that actually work as well as the artificial ones that we were promised, and we don't understand them. And so this turned out to have been encapsulated in a wonderful quote that's often cited by Richard Feynman: "What I cannot create, I do not understand." When I tracked down this quote, it turns out that this was on his board at the time of his death. And so, this is the actual quote, along with "know how to solve every problem that has been solved." And the other thing I learned from this is be very careful what you leave on your board when you go off from a trip, because that's what you're going to be. So I've been very careful to put wise sayings on my board, even for this trip, because especially how sick I am, you never know. Okay, so this is really the theme. Neuro AI, which is reverse engineering the brain. So the idea is that we can get insights from the brain to build better AI, and by building better AI, we can get insights from the brain to build better AI, and by building better AI, we can understand how the brain works. And today, I'm only going to focus really on the building better AI. So the first question that one could ask is, how would we even know if we had AI? And this used to be a simple question to which we thought we knew the answer, and that answer was provided by Alan Turing, who not only had the idea, laid the foundation for modern computing, but also provided what for many years was the working answer to how we would know if we had AI. And the answer was the so-called imitation game, which now is known as the Turing test. And the original idea was a little bit more complicated, but it nowadays boils down to something like this, which is you have somebody sitting in a room and he's getting answers from somebody who's either a machine or a human testee. And based on those answers, he has to distinguish which of those two, which is which, right? And for many years, that was so completely inconceivable that seemed like a perfectly reasonable test. It also seemed like a pretty reasonable test just in terms of, if you could do that, then you ought to be able to do anything a human could do, right? That is sort of the definition. That's a pretty good definition of intelligence. So nowadays, as you all know, we have large language models such as ChatGPT. And so I asked ChatGPT a little while ago, what is the Turing test and can you pass the Turing test? And blah, 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 answers. The bottom line is it's being modest, but it certainly can pass the Turing test. And to the extent that it can't, and if you go and you actually play with your large language model and test it, part of the reason that it's not quite right is that they actually go out of their way to make sure that it keeps telling you that it's a large language model precisely because it does such a good job passing the Turing test. So what can we conclude from that? Can we conclude that we're done? That we have achieved human-level intelligence? I think not. I think that AI still isn't perfect. This is sort of the typical kind of failure you get, old man hugging a unicorn. There's something wrong with this that I'm trying to figure it out, but I was told. So AI can fail in seemingly unexpected ways, right? And sort of what I'll be talking about is the ways in which it fails. Like what is it? Why is it failing that way? And what is sort of common to those kinds of failures? So one way to think about it is, and this derives from the way that AIs are created, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. But generally speaking, AI fails on so-called edge cases. So AI is trained. Actually, all AI systems are trained by consuming huge amounts of data and figuring out sort of what the patterns are. And the problem is that to the extent that a given example is not included in the training set, or something like it is not included in the training set, it will actually not do a great job on it. So here's a classic example. This is a cow, and so I'll say that every example here that I'm going to show you has been fixed, but it's representative of similar examples that haven't been fixed. So in this case, this is from a paper from a few years ago. This is a cow on a grassy background, and if you ask a machine vision system to identify it, it will correctly identify it as a cow. This is a cow on a sandy background on a beach, but because cows are less often found on sandy backgrounds, it mislabeled it a camel. Okay, now this kind of mistake happens all the time. One way to think about this mistake is, well, it just hasn't seen enough pictures of cows on sandy backgrounds. This approach is known as collecting a large enough data set so that basically has seen everything. And that doesn't seem very tractable or viable solution. Another approach is to recognize that this is because the system is giving more weight to the background than it should, more than any biological system would. And that has to do with the fact that these things aren't being trained really to solve the right problem. And that, I think, is a lot closer to what's going on. But the usual approach these days is to play whack-a-mole with all these sort of special cases and just hope that as you expand the data set, you'll be able to make these less and less common. Here's some more examples where this has come up and been a problem. This is from a couple years ago. Is a headline in a paper: self-driving Tesla crashes into $3.5 million private jet using smart summon feature. So this is obviously a much more practical concern for certainly many of the people who, well, we'll just leave that one aside. The problem here is that these kinds of problems have real-world consequences. And so that same kind of problem of not generalizing properly is shown here. Autopilot blamed for Tesla's crash into overturned truck. So basically, unless we can solve all these edge cases, right, these AI systems which work pretty well will never really be good enough. So I keep referring to this idea of scaling, of collecting more data. This has really been the dominant paradigm for the companies in Silicon Valley that are driving these systems. This is a quote from Nando de Freitas, who's at that time at DeepMind. He writes, he tweeted a few years ago, "It's all about scale now. The game is over. It's about making these models bigger, safer, compute efficient, faster at sampling, smarter memory, etc." And indeed, over the last 4 or 5 years, these large language models, a lot of the technology that has gone into places like OpenAI, which makes ChatGPT, and Anthropic, which makes Claude, have been to solve engineering problems, which are very challenging, of how to collect and manage these larger data sets. But it is not at all clear that scaling is going to actually solve these problems in the long run. And there are, clear examples where no matter how much you scale, it won't ultimately get what you want. So over the last 100+ years, airplanes went from flying a few feet above the ground to 23 miles. That's the record for how far above the ground they can go. But just because of the way airplanes work, they will never scale to flying to the moon because they require atmosphere, oxygen. So brute force scaling, I submit, will not fix all these edge cases. Now, all of these are manifestations of what has been known in the field for almost 40 years now. Actually, it's been known for longer, but it's been known as Moravec's paradox for 40 years. I'm going to read this because it's really this is the summary of my talk that I wish I had been able to compose as nicely as Moravec, but I always read it because he wrote it so nicely. So he was a roboticist, and about 40 years ago he wrote, "Encoded in the large, highly evolved sensory and motor portions of the human brain is 1 billion years of experience about the nature of the world and how to survive in it. The deliberate process we call reasoning is, I believe, the thinnest veneer of human thought, effective only because it is supported by this much older and much more powerful, though usually unconscious, sensory motor knowledge. We are all prodigious Olympians in perceptual and motor areas, so good that we make the difficult look easy. Abstract thought, though, is a new trick, perhaps less than 100,000 years old. We have not yet mastered it. It is not all that intrinsically difficult. It just seems so when we do it." So what he's really saying is that we need to think about intelligence as sort of undergoing a Moravecian revolution. So intuitively, I think most of us think about intelligence with and thought with us at the center. We put the things that we do, the things that are uniquely human, the things that are hard for humans, at the center, chess and Go and conversation. And then we put things that like other animals can do as sort of planning, higher planning, reasoning, which is things that some higher animals can do, elephants and octopuses and wolves. And then all this other stuff that all animals can do, that's got to be the easiest, right? Things that worms and flies and spiders can do. But that's the wrong way to think about it. The right way to think about it is that it's to put it the inside out, where the hardest things, the core abilities, the things that all animals can do, those are actually the hardest things. That took evolution hundreds of millions of years to figure out. And all the rest of that stuff, the things that make us uniquely human, even though they're hard for us, that's because, as Moravec said, we only had 100,000 years to sort of figure out how to do them. We're just not that good at them yet, but they're not all that intrinsically hard. They're a tiny step once you have the rest. So basically, the Moravecian revolution is to decenter humans in thinking about evolution. So Moravec's paradox explains why AI can defeat a world champion at Go as it did in 2017, but we still don't have robots that wash our dishes. So when I give this talk or versions of this talk to AI engineers, where it's usually a pretty quick conversation, pretty quickly the conversation turns to birds and planes and feathers. And the engineer argument goes something like this. It says, look, when people first started building planes, sure, they were inspired by birds, by the ability of birds to fly. But when we build better jets, we don't turn to birds to figure out how to put better feathers on our jets, right? And the answer is yes, that's true. But we already have things that are like jets in the computer world, which is computers. Computers can outperform brains in many domains. But if the problem definition, if the goal were to build planes capable of so-called artificial general flight, of doing all the things that a bird can do, right? We would actually probably do best to throw away the jet engines and look closely at how birds are able to do these kinds of things. So yes, it's true that a jet can fly, 1,000 miles an hour, but no jet can swoop in and grab not one, but 2 fish. Look at that. From the water or sort of just hover in front of a flower. So to sort of explain where we need to go, I'm going to take a couple of minutes to give you a brief history of artificial intelligence. I think the first really important advance in artificial intelligence was in 1780 with the mechanical chess Turk. It was this amazing chess-playing machine that swept Europe for, I think, the better part of 20 or 30 years. There's a famous game between the mechanical Turk and Napoleon, actually. So, and it beat Napoleon in several games. And it made use of a very ingenious device. When you opened it up, you saw a whole bunch of gears. And what was so ingenious about it was that somehow you could open it up and not see the little human inside of it. So the mechanical Turk actually had a little human inside of it, doing everything that was necessary to win a chess game. So I think that once again reflects the fact that the problem definition is to do what a human can do. In fact, in this case, a human who's a very good chess player. Fast forward a few years, and the sort of modern history of AI, I think, begins with an absolutely pivotal paper, foundational paper by McCulloch and Pitts in 1943. McCulloch was a psychiatrist, I believe, who ended up recruiting and working very closely with this brilliant child prodigy named Walter Pitts, who never actually did get a degree. But in 1943, they published a paper where they laid out the modern idea of an artificial neural network. And here's one of the diagrams from their paper. But they were the first people to think about the relationship, to really think about and mathematically formulate the brain as a computational device composed of a bunch of small neurons that are interacting. And that paper was so their contribution was that a computation could be defined in terms of a bunch of neurons interacting through synapses. That paper actually was so foundational that 2 years later, when von Neumann, who, among others, was one of the great mathematical physicists of the 20th century, arguably the greatest mathematical physicist, but he also, among other things, laid out the foundation, the architecture for the modern computer. So everything from the computer that I'm presenting this talk on to the iPhone that's in your pocket, those are all known as instances of von Neumann machines. And he laid out the basic architecture in this 1945 report, and he cited exactly one paper in that, and that was the paper by McCulloch and Pitts. A good fraction of that paper, maybe one out of the 6 or 7 chapters, was an attempt to sort of relate the architecture of the modern computer to what was known about how brains worked at that time. So von Neumann had in his mind that we should be mimicking the brain in building computers. The next major advance was a psychologist named Frank Rosenblatt, who proposed that not only should computation occur through a bunch of interacting neurons, but that the synapses should be the site at which you sort of effectively program these artificial neural networks. In other words, that you should learn by examples, and that the learning should be put into the synaptic weights. So learning is modifying synaptic weights. So every good story needs a villain, and that's provided here. So in 1956, there was the Dartmouth Conference on Artificial Intelligence, and that gathered together a bunch of thinkers in early computing who proposed a different way of achieving artificial intelligence, one that would pay no attention to how the brain worked. So the villain here is Marvin Minsky. He was, in case you didn't see him, he was this guy right there. And basically, that sort of set the field back and caused a digression for the better part of 20 or 30 years. And so when I started as a graduate student in the mid-'80s, we were doing battle with the so-called symbolic AI team of artificial intelligence, so much that what we were doing wasn't, we didn't refer to what we were doing as AI because they had co-opted that term. But the fact that neural networks are now synonymous with AI indicates which is the winning strategy. Okay, so I'm not going to go through all these different advances. I'll note that Terry Sinofsky was a previous speaker in this series here. Hopfield and Hinton won the Nobel Prize for their contributions. So much for the history. NeuroAI, which is, so this has led to the field of NeuroAI, which is that neuroscience has been the inspiration for most major advances in AI and will continue to be the inspiration for coming years. And so what I'm going to talk about now is ways in which I think insights from neuroscience can provide further sort of fodder for fixing some of the issues with modern AI. All right, and I'm going to talk about 3 of them. So the first one is the so-called alignment problem, which is the problem of AI safety. And one formulation of that, probably the most popular, was from about 20 years ago, Nick Bostrom, who posed it as a thought experiment. And what he laid out was this scenario. He called it the AI paperclip maximizer. So he says, supposing that we have an AI whose only goal is to make as many paperclips as possible. The AI will realize quickly that it would be much better if there were no humans, because humans might decide to switch it off. And because if humans do so, there would be fewer paperclips. Also, human bodies contain a lot of atoms that could be made into paperclips. The future that the AI would be trying to gear toward would be one in which there were a lot of paperclips, but no humans. So this seems kind of fanciful, right? But in some sense, it actually, I mean, obviously it's reductio ad absurdum. No one would do that with paperclips. No society would focus itself on maximizing a single goal, certainly not something like paperclips. But it does capture something very fundamental about the way that AI works, which is that most AIs, in fact, almost all AIs, are trained to maximize a single target function, right? When we train a vision system, we train the vision system to do it the best it could possibly do, identifying a bunch of images. And for identifying images, that seems like maybe not such a bad idea, but for a situation like this, you could see where that could be problematic. By contrast, animals can balance multiple goals. And so famously, all animals know how to sort of balance the famous 4 Fs: feeding, fleeing, fighting, and mating. And so somehow all animals, by balancing these multiple goals, have figured out how to sort of set them, balance them appropriately. Now, in humans, this gives rise to sort of far more complex behaviors. In fact, balancing these goals appropriately is at the basis of modern morality. And although I'm not going to talk much more about it, I'm not going to talk much more about it today at all, except for this next slide. This has led to sort of a line of work in my lab that I'm just beginning, which is the idea that we can, if we want safe AI, we can think about it in terms of, if you like, AI domestication, right? So we actually, as humans, we have a lot of experience taking agents with their own set of goals and aligning them to our own goals. And that is the process of domestication. So here is, of course, the ancestral wolf, and we have managed to domesticate the progeny of creatures like this so that they are less threatening to us. And I think that we can do the same with AI. There's no fundamental reason that we couldn't get AIs that not only balance multiple goals, but where we've shaped those goals in such a way that they align with what we want. Okay, so I've solved one of the big problems, 2 more to go. The second one is the energy problem. So many of you may know that AI is incredibly inefficient. So, let's just say power hungry. So an AI system, like our brains use about 20 watts. And by contrast, it's hard to know exactly what the right comparison is, but one way to think about the comparison is the amount of power it would take to run the computer hardware, the GPUs needed to to run a large language model that's able to have a conversation with us. And that would be of order 5,000 watts, something like that. Another sort of interesting statistic is that we don't really know, but it is estimated that the energy used to train ChatGPT, one of the modern large language models, is roughly the amount of energy it takes to run a medium-sized city for about a week. That's obviously far, far more energy than it takes a child, than it takes to train a child to speak, which can be done for a fraction of that. So we know what it is about brain hardware that makes it so energy efficient. Roughly speaking, it has to do with the fact that individual neurons interact through spikes. They transmit information through so-called action potentials or spikes. And they do so, spiking occurs very infrequently. So a typical neuron in the cortex might produce only one spike every 10 seconds. And in the hardware, or the way that the nervous system is set up, the way that neurons work, the vast majority of the energy used by a neuron goes into generating a spike, or in fact, not to generating the spike, but to restoring the ionic balances after an action potential has been generated. So the fewer spikes, the less energy a neuron uses up to a point, which is the resting energy of a neuron. So if we could build hardware that only used energy when it sent a message, then, which we could, then if we could figure out how to compute with spikes, we could get AI systems that operate in that regime. Unfortunately, right now, we don't really know how to compute in the regime of spiking neurons, and that's an ongoing project with one of the neuro-AI scholars at Cold Spring Harbor. Okay, finally, I'm going to spend the last few minutes of the talk describing one that I've been working on quite a bit recently, which is the learning problem. The fact that modern AI systems are very inefficient learners, and as a result, they learn, if you like, the wrong thing. And this relates to what I was saying earlier about needing huge training sets and never being done. Okay, so as I've alluded to, but I'm going to state a little bit more clearly now, all AI systems today rely on learning. And what that means is they detect the statistical regularities from huge data sets. This is a little grid just to indicate, thousands of labeled images. Modern systems are trained on billions of labeled images. And then there's an algorithm called backpropagation, also known as gradient descent, which extracts the statistical structure of these images into what's known as a weight matrix, which are just the synaptic connections between these artificial units. And this weight matrix allows a bunch of inputs, which are the pixels of an image, to be associated with the correct output, which would be the label. So, a picture of a cat, the word cat. A picture of a dog, the word dog, right? Somehow, all the transformation that enables that to happen are all encoded in the billions of parameters in this weight matrix, or in the case of a large language model, the parameters that allow it to predict the next word in a sentence, which is the core of a large language model, are encoded in the trillions of parameters. Now, the interesting thing is that all neural network training starts so-called tabula rasa, as blank slates. So there need to be a lot of labeled examples to learn from these parameters. Humans do not rely mostly on supervised learning. Labeling objects every second for a year would still only be a very small number of examples, something like 3 × 10⁷. And that's, clearly not how we do it. So what about unsupervised learning, which is where you don't give them the labels? That kind of data is cheaper to get. Jan LeCun, one of the pioneers in AI, whom I mentioned earlier, famously said in 2016, if intelligence is the cake, the bulk of the cake is unsupervised learning. The icing on the cake is supervised learning, and the cherry on the cake is reinforcement learning. Excuse me. But I would say that even unsupervised learning isn't enough. A squirrel can learn to jump from tree to tree in 10 million seconds. A whole horse can stand seconds after birth. A spider can hunt the moment it's born. A termite queen can figure out how to build a mound. I mean, I don't even know if that's the right term, but you can put a termite egg in the ground and you'll get a bunch of termites and they'll build a mound, right? So somehow that knowledge has been encoded somewhere in the termite egg or something, somewhere, right? And produces a mound. A given bird will produce a species-specific nest without being taught how to do so. And beavers build dams. Here's a great video. I recommend looking up Justin Beaver, the rescue beaver. This woman adopted a beaver as a pup or whatever a baby beaver is, and took it into her home. And without ever having seen another beaver build a dam, it felt compelled to start building a dam in her house. And that's the beaver taking her daughter's lacrosse stick, trying to chop down part of her door, and then eventually trying to drag all these things into the bathtub to build a dam. So somehow it didn't succeed in building a dam in the bathtub, but it sort of had the prototype, the basic behavioral building blocks of doing that. For whatever reason, people don't typically study beavers in the lab, but Hopi Hoekstra has been studying a sort of slightly less dramatic, but still very interesting kind of behavior in two kinds of mice, the old field mouse and the deer mouse. The old field mouse builds this long, elaborate tunnel with a little escape hatch here, and the deer mouse builds this little stubby tunnel that looks like that. And through cross-fostering experiments, she's shown that the kind of tunnel that a given mouse builds depends not on its foster parents, but on its biological parents. So whatever is inducing the mouse to build this kind of tunnel versus that kind of tunnel is there in the genes. And, we could just keep listing a lot of these innate behaviors, building mounds, following your mother, et cetera, et cetera. So learning is overrated. That's sort of the upshot that I'm trying to give you here. The brain comes mostly prepackaged. And so with all, so with all due respect to Jan LeCun, who's French, this is what the right answer is. The brain comes in a little package that looks like that. So summary so far, AI relies on, at least of this part, AI relies on learning. Natural intelligence relies on innate strategies. And innate strategies arise through an evolutionary curriculum. So innate behaviors are encoded in our genes, right? That's basically where else could they be? If they're not learned, then they're coming from our genes. So this has led me to start thinking about how complicated is this brain generating program. So somehow we go from a single cell, right? We all started as a single cell with DNA, and that DNA encodes in it whatever set of rules we're going to have to follow, or that egg is going to have to follow to build a body and a brain. And that brain has a wiring diagram. So how complicated is that? Well, we can represent the wiring diagram of the brain as this weight matrix, and we can sort of quantify the complexity of that wiring diagram in bits, the same kind of bits that, represent how many gigabytes of RAM your computer has, or your iPhone has, or how much people used to get charged for their cellular plans. So we can count, it's very easy to count the number of bits in the genome because there are 4 different nucleotides. So each nucleotide encodes 2 bits. and we have sequenced many genomes. And so for a simple model organism, the simplest model organism that neurobiologists study called C. elegans, we know that the genome contains about 100 million bits, and we know that the circuitry of C. elegans has 302 neurons and 7,000 synapses, and that is at most 60,000 bits. So there's no problem. I'm not saying this is how the wiring diagram of C. elegans is actually constructed, but if we wanted to, we could just say, it could be like IKEA, attach neuron 1 to neuron 3, attach neuron 4 to neuron 8, or whatever, right? There's no challenge there. However, there's a somewhat different problem when it comes to humans. And the problem that we face with humans is that the human genome is only somewhat larger than that of C. elegans, but the complexity of our wiring diagram is many, many orders of magnitude. And so it's a difference between about 1 gigabyte in terms of the capacity, the maximum capacity. If every single bit in our genome were devoted to wiring up the brain, which it is not, it still would be off by a factor of 10 to the 6 orders of magnitude, 1 million, for wiring up a brain. So is that a mystery? Well, it's not really a mystery. It only seems so when laid out this way. What it says is that the genome specifies the rules for wiring a brain, not the actual wiring diagram explicitly. And so what it means in particular is that not all possible brains can be represented by the genome. And so what that has led to is a series of algorithms that my lab has developed that sort of capture that genomic compression, the fact that the genome is actually a completely compressed version of the ultimate wiring diagram of the brain. And so that has led to some algorithms shown, well, you can't really see it down here, but we've recently published a paper on this, that the solution to this slow learning, or a possible sort of direction to think about how to solve this problem of slow learning, is that instead of doing what we typically do in AI systems, which is each time there's a huge new data set, we consume this huge data set at tremendous costs, digest it into a weight matrix, take this weight matrix, call that the solution, and throw away the data. And then the next time we get a new data set, we start all over again. If instead we can sort of take all that we've previously learned and keep the important parts in our genome, then each time we get a little something extra that we want to learn, we don't have to start all over again. We can build in this iterative process, just the way that evolution allows us to start all over again each generation and then develop into a slightly different organism. We can sort of adapt that. And so that has been what we think has been a useful direction to end up with more efficient learning, and also learning that is sort of better aligned to what we animals and humans actually learn in the world. And so this has led to an ongoing project in the lab of an evolutionary curriculum that starts at the abilities of simple organisms and then adds to them just the same way that we got to humans. So just a few closing thoughts here. Basically, the jump from mouse to human intelligence is really pretty short. We're maybe somewhere here. That's a worm, and that's an artificial worm. That's an artificial bee, and we're maybe somewhere around here on this long path. And ChatGPT, although it's super cool, and I'm a huge fan of large language models, ChatGPT and Claude, they're not on this path. it's something cool and interesting and fun and useful, but it's not really on the path to artificial human intelligence if that's what we want. It's just this, like, as Jan LeCun has called it, an off-ramp. So I'll close with some speculation about why humans are so successful. And by successful, I mean we're, the dominant. Basically, I saw this beautiful, I should have included in this talk. If you look at all the biomass of vertebrates on the planet, all the biomass of vertebrates on the surface, at least on the surface of the Earth, not the oceans, are humans or domestic animals. So humans plus, like, basically all birds on Earth left over are chickens. There are basically no wild birds left by biomass, and all other animals are pigs, cows, or humans. So why are we so successful? Is it because we're so good at learning? Nope, it's not because of that. Humans are very good at learning, but we may not be much better than, let's say, other apes. I don't think that's the key to our success. Humans have been around for over 100,000 years, and for most of that time, in fact, things like humans and Neanderthals have been around for a million years, and for most of that time, our population sizes were tiny, so tiny that 70,000 years ago, we almost went extinct. So most of our time on Earth, we haven't been very successful by any measure. And yet, anatomically, we've been pretty much the same. So what happened to make us more successful? It's not that something changed in us. What happened was that our success derives from cultural evolution, which has been enabled by language. So basically, cultural evolution enables us to accumulate knowledge and break the genomic bottleneck. But all of our human behavior builds on these 500 million years of animal behavior. And with that, I would just like to thank you for your attention. I'm done.
Hi, can I ask the questions now?
Yeah.
Thank you. We're glad, Professor Zador, you're here and to give us this talk. And we know that the modern day AI and neuroscience have diverged. And thank you for the contributions on bridging the gap. And so I have two questions. One is that since that genomic bottleneck allows the wiring of the neural networks and also the compression as well. So what's the implemented priors in neural networks corresponding to the innate behaviors in animals? The second question is that we know that a perfect example of modern day AI is GPT, which is based on transformers. But we know that transformers is not a good example for the neurological mechanism. So some other models like ANN and CNN are. So you mentioned that backpropagation. So we know that backpropagation is used in ANN and CNN. Then but what makes backpropagation
So powerful.
Powerful, but
Okay. So I think what you're, are you?
Yeah, I'm sorry. But backpropagation requires rigorous, almost identical facilitations in the synapse, which seemingly impossible in neuroscience. So.
Right. So I'll start with the second question. So backpropagation is sort of the engine that has allowed all modern AI to succeed. It is the process of adjusting the weights of an artificial neural network to achieve whatever the objective function is. I don't believe that any biological organism does anything like backpropagation. I think that basically evolution provides us with a neural circuit that essentially does what backpropagation has to do in sort of one training set. So evolution is a far, far less efficient algorithm than backpropagation. And the only reason it works is that it has operated on something like 10 to the 30, 10 to the 35 individuals over the last 500 million years. That said, when building artificial systems, I'm all for using whatever tools work, and backpropagation has been, is an incredibly useful algorithm, and one that I wouldn't actually, I think it's a way in which we have vastly outperformed what biology has come up with. I think backpropagation is the reason that over the course of a few hours or few days or even, $100 million worth of training, we're able to recapitulate anything that's comparable to what biological organisms took 500 million years to do. So I'm a huge fan of backpropagation in building artificial systems. I think you also had a question there about transformers, and I'll say that this is sort of in the weeds, but for those of you who are interested, transformers, which are the ANN architecture, the artificial neural network architecture that underlies all large language models, they have succeeded not just or even primarily because they're such a good architecture, but because they are extremely well matched to GPU hardware. And so there's this beautiful paper called The Hardware Lottery, which describes how an algorithm and a hardware architecture can co-evolve to sort of produce something that, to produce something that works even better. So basically what happened was transformers basically require multiplying large matrices, and that's what GPUs are good at. And what I would propose is that if we had a different architecture, one on which, for example, spikes were efficient to run, we could sort of we could develop a bunch of algorithms that run efficiently on those that might actually be a lot closer to what runs in our brains. So.
Okay, thank you.
Hello, thank you for the interesting talk. I was wondering if you could describe your algorithms for the evolutionary model, but in the language of LLMs. So, like, is a single neuron the organism, or is the whole network the organism?
Yes.
How is the feedback by natural selection implemented?
So, I'm sorry, is the question whether one could apply the algorithm to an LLM or whether I can use language?
Just not describing the LLM, but describe how your model works using the language that you would use to describe the LLM, like neuron and feedback and weighting.
Yeah, so I sort of, I glossed over the details of the algorithm. Essentially what we do is we train the network to perform a standard task. So if you're familiar with the basic tasks like MNIST and CFAR, which are standard off-the-shelf object recognition tasks, we train the network using standard algorithms to perform this task. And then there's a next step where we train a different network to predict the weights between any two pairs of neurons in the trained network. And so that second network has a smaller number of parameters than the first network, and it represents what we call the genome. It is a simple model of a genome. And then that produces an approximation of the first network, a compressed version of the first network. And then we retrain that and iterate. And what we end up with is a network, a genome that is orders of magnitude smaller than the original network, but that generates a starting network that's almost ready, almost as good as the final network that a normal algorithm would produce. And so it's basically like, the colt that's a little unsteady but can learn to walk in a few minutes. That's sort of what we do. So we can do that with basically any of the standard benchmarks, including the standard object recognition or image recognition tasks like MNIST and CFAR and ImageNet, as well as there's a suite of fun reinforcement learning tasks where you teach a simulated animal to walk. But I, for the interest of time, I cut out some of those examples.
Okay, that's what I was wanting to hear. Thank you.
Yep.
Oh, what you gave was what I wanted to hear.
Yeah.
Hi. I just wanted to hear your opinion on what you think about the recent reasoning models like O1 and O3 and DeepSeek, and if you think self-play or multiple models arguing with each other and breaking plans up into pieces, and if you think that's a promising path forward to general intelligence.
Well, so I think it's a promising path to better reasoning models. And I think okay, for people who are not in the know, the standard large language models circa until about a year ago were all sort of simple next token prediction models, meaning that the way they operate is that they're trying to just generate a sequence of tokens, which you can think about as words. And the approach has been to make them bigger and bigger and bigger, and they got better and better and better at predicting words. People then began to realize that there was something sort of fundamental missing there, which is the ability to kind of take the output that you've just generated and if you like, think about it. And so this was inspired by the fact that the way that people have solved games like chess and Go is that they look at a given board position, let's say for chess, and they evaluate how good that board position is, and then they evaluate how good would it be if I took this next move or that next move or that next move. And then they explored sort of in a tree structure a bunch of possible next moves, a bunch of possible next moves. And so they took, and that is how basically all the chess and Go and comparable type machines work. They took that approach and applied it to large language models. And so these large language models say, well, what would happen if I did this? And then they sort of think for a while. What would happen if I did that? And they think for a while. It has been pretty clear that this is really useful in some domains. And for example, for mathematical proofs, this is what has gotten the recent class of large language models from being able to do high school math and physics really well, I'll say, because I used them when I was trying to help my son with his physics homework. But well beyond that, to solving like math Olympiad level problems. So the latest benchmarks on these are that these things can actually solve really, really hard math problems. And there's Terence Tao, who's one of the greatest living mathematicians, has now been working closely with these models and sort of uses them and claims that they really help him think. They don't give him answers he didn't get, but they help him think through problems. So they're now I think many people expect that in the next couple years, this approach is going to be proving theorems that no human has thought of or proven. They're going to start rendering, they're going to start outperforming mathematicians. Now that said, it's completely consistent with Moravec's paradox. I don't think that this approach per se is going to get us to the core problems that we have, which in my opinion are not the things that are challenging for humans, right? Like I left this picture up here. If you notice, right, like that robot's fingers become human on that side, right? That is the kind of problem that these systems will continue to have, and doing that kind of search is not going to solve. The problems of autonomous driving, right? Autonomous driving is pretty much the simplest, almost the simplest problem that you could think of in terms of interacting with the physical world, with the real physical world, right? I mean, driving is a really restricted domain, right? The rules are really quite simple. And the economic incentives obviously have been enormous. People have estimated that somewhere between companies have invested between $1 and $200 billion in developing autonomous vehicles. And I remember in 2015, 2016, they were predicting that by 2020, driving cars is no longer going to be a job. And here we are at 2025. If you go to San Francisco, you can ride a Waymo, right? And those are pretty cool, but they're also a little bit scary sometimes. And the fact is that there are, there's a little bit of Wizard of Oz activity going on there, because there's a room somewhere in Northern California where there are hundreds of Waymo overseers who are ready to get the Waymos out of complicated situations. So, they can get to 95 or 98% of the way there, but they're not yet 100%, and they keep not being at 100%, and they keep thinking that more and more data is going to get them closer and closer. So I guess I would say that I'm not bullish that that's going to do, it's going to do something. It's going to, I think it has the ability to put a great number of white-collar workers out of work, but it's not going to put any blue-collar workers out of work.
Nice talk. Question, we have the same genome size as a horse to a first approximation. What is the horse doing right that it can encode this much innate knowledge in a way that it seems like people don't do it?
Oh, I don't think it's that we couldn't do it. We have chosen. So there's a trait, like humans have obviously evolved to not work completely out of the box, right? We have evolved because of our ability to learn. Well, we want to make sure that we can learn the things that need to be learned. So the whole trick, and I guess I would say the whole trick, is figuring out which things need to be learned and which things you want to build in. So let's say that, to take a simple example, if you're an animal that likes to find fruit, okay? Well, you should have some kind of innate prior that says, go to fruit trees. But your innate prior can't be, go to a fruit tree located right there, because any given individual needs to know where the fruit trees that are present in its environment will be. So humans, right, we just leave room for lots and lots of things to be learned. Everything that we learn in the course of cultural evolution, right, we have to leave sort of as blank. We can't, it would not be advantageous for us to, for example, come into the world speaking Japanese if we end up in a culture where people speak English. So instead, babies come into the world speaking nothing at all, but they have the capacity to learn whatever language is spoken around them very, very quickly, right? And so
there's an inherent trade-off to what needs to, that if you're going to have more capacity to learn, you should come in knowing less.
That's right. Yeah, I think that's exactly right, that we, there's an inherent trade-off, and we we want to leave blank those things that are useful to be blank. I don't think, as someone who remembers well how difficult my life became when my 14-month-old learned to walk, I don't think we would actually want our children, our babies, to know how to walk any earlier than 14 months. In fact, it would be ideal if we could put that off even a little bit longer, right? So I think that, I would argue that evolution could have designed babies that could have walked from the moment they're born, but we selected against that because they don't have the judgment to know where to walk. And that's because there's all this other stuff that's being acculturated. So I know that, everyone is impressed by humans who are precocious, right, who can walk early or speak early. But I think if there were an evolutionary advantage to that, we would all be there. I think there's a good reason that it takes as long as it does.
So we have one last question.
Okay, thank you for the excellent talk, and I have a few questions. So from my opinion, the modern artificial intelligence development stem from, for example, neural network. They take inspiration from the high level of the human neurons, in the original design, but later on, with the development of the more and more complicated neural network like CNNs and the later transformers, it seems that the learning algorithm of the neural networks has diverged from mimicking the mechanism of human brains, and it seems to have its own way of development and becomes more and more powerful after scaling with these ways, with more data, with larger scale of the models. And so I would like to know that for the and it has also shown a great success with the scaling and its own training method by propagation, supervised learning, and generating text tokens with large language models. So how much more in the learning level or algorithm level can artificial intelligence still borrow or learn from human brains in the algorithm design? And meanwhile, I understand that you mentioned human brain consume less energy than the modern artificial intelligence models and generalize better. So these are actually some shortcomings of the modern model and algorithm. So in what way or what potential approach can modern artificial intelligence methods leverage these advantages from human brain to become a better model?
So the first thing I'll say is that you said, well, sure, the original artificial neural networks took inspiration from neurons, but since then, if you look at CNNs and transformers, not so much. Well, CNNs are actually perhaps the most dramatic example of the advantage that comes from thinking about the biology. CNNs, convolutional neural networks, were literally inspired. So convolutional neural networks were an insight from, first proposed by Jan LeCun in, I think, 1989. And the inspiration for those literally came from studying the organization of the visual cortex from Hubel and Wiesel. So that's the canonical example of how, or that's one of the most impressive examples of how thinking deeply about how biology works can inspire better AI. But another example, right? So all of modern reinforcement learning, which is is having a research, it was what was responsible for for Go and AlphaGo and chess and the Nobel Prize in AlphaFold, right? That came from Peter Dayan, who are a lot, sort of its import into artificial neural networks was largely the work of Peter Dayan and also Rick Sutton. And Peter Dayan was a postdoc with Terry Sinofsky who was working on biology. And all that work and the work of Rich Sutton came from thinking about how animals learn. We could go to the idea of dropout, which is an important tool in training modern neural networks, which was an insight from Yashua Bengio in thinking about stochastic neural firing. And actually, I think that might have been Jeff Hinton, but anyway. Transformers, although transformers per se are one of the few examples that were not inspired, the attention mechanism was actually inspired by thinking about biological attention. So we can go on and on. What ends up happening over and over again is that you have the core idea comes from neuroscience, and then its elaboration is the work of many, many people in the field of artificial neural network, mostly engineers, many of whom lose track of, sort of lose any sense of their debt to the original underlying neuroscience idea. And so my argument here has been that happened, that there's an untapped potential here for a small subset of engineers and computer scientists who are willing to sort of explore, and physicists or whoever, willing to explore neuroscience for these ideas to figure out how to abstract them and bring them into, to make them become useful algorithms in artificial neural networks. So I guess I would say that, yes, for sure, there's going to be this scaling that happens through engineers, and that's just pure engineering, right? You don't need to be a neuroscientist to figure out how to make a bunch of GPUs talk to each other faster. But the core ideas often will come from neuroscience.
Thank you so much. Please join me in thanking you.